Right, before I start, I just want to say thanks to Adam for putting this on. Also well done to Will for his talk, it was really good. And also the alternative August thing. If you haven't seen Gavin Strange talk before, highly recommend it, like you really should. He's mental, but he's brilliant. So right, I'm going to talk a bit about animating stuff in React Native. So I have to start a presentation with a poll. So who here regularly writes stuff in React Native? Okay, quite a few. Have used it once or twice? Okay. Heard of it but never used it? Okay, never heard of it. Cool. Nobody put their hand up for the last one, that's good. I don't need to bother with that slide. So, why do we animate stuff when we're building applications? So I'm going to cover like 3 different things. I like to break this down to 3 different things of why we animate things. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but I find it quite helpful. So one of the things we want to know is what just happened in an application. So as state is changing, if things are popping in and out of the screen, like without animating, it can be quite jarring and disorienting. Aesthetics, so you just want to give a particular feel to something. And interactivity, so gestures and swipes and drags and drops and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to cover each of these 3 and talk about some libraries that exist in React Native that can help you do each of those 3 things. So first of all, we're going to cover orientation, about what just happened. So I'm on the wrong side really, but some examples of why we need to animate things when we're changing state. So you see here a screen comes up and it lets you know that that screen, again, when you're finished, whenever you're finished, come on, there we go, it's going to go away again. You expect it to go the other way. And also when the state is changing here, these buttons are animating in and things are animating in and out, and it helps you like ground yourself in the application. Another example here, we've gone from having a big camera on screen to having something small. If that was to just pop from the big square to the small circle, it could be quite disorienting. So I'm going to do a quick demo of a thing called layout animation, which exists in React Native. It's a core part of React Native. I think it's not particularly heard of, but it's really, really good. So I just want to show you a demo of what we can do to get some of these kind of like orienting animations. So I have made a little React Native app, and I got this thing here where you click on these numbers and they disappear out of the list. I can bring back, it's not really filters, but some kind of controls and restore everything. So it's not particularly easy to see what exactly is going on. Like you've got these, like 6 is turning into 9 here, and like it's like 1 pixel off, and it's just weird. So with layout animation in React Native, with pretty much 1 line of code, actually with 1 line of code you can do it. So what's happening here, can't really read that very well. So this is just a class that I'm just got a list of numbers and then filtering out some items in state. So I've got omitted items and I just add that on whenever I tap on something. But I've got a method here which I call prepare animation, and it will run this thing called layout animation configure next. And what this does is it works out the position that your views are in before and after your state transition, and it will just animate it for you. You don't have to do any kind of like tweening or like any of that kind of stuff. It just kind of works. This here is, these are saying what happens when I have a new element or what happens if an element has disappeared. So you can tell it to animate either the scale of something, so it will like zoom in and out, or you can get it to animate the opacity of something. So with 1 line of code and the joys of hot reloading, which may have worked, let's have a look. Hey. So that's much more, you can kind of see what's going on, and then when we restore, you get this nice little, and you can do this really quickly, it's quite fun. Cool, so that's that. That one. So yeah, you literally can do it in one line of code. It does feel like cheating, I've got to admit, it's a bit too easy, but it's really powerful. So the next thing is aesthetics in an application, so how you want to make someone feel when they're using it. So here's another example. So imagine you've received a gift from somebody and you don't know what that gift is. So a little bit of animation can just kind of build a bit of tension and a bit of drama, and also like make you wait for this thing to happen before you press the back button. So you really have to take everything in. And again, just some little transitions that kind of makes the app feel nicer. I can't really describe it any better than that. So let's have another demo. There's a thing called react-native-animatable, and that is a library that comes with a bunch of like pre-canned animations that you can control, like the delay and duration. You can also write your own kind of keyframed animations. So I'll show you a demo of that. I'll sit down for this one. Cool, so we got cats. I haven't got jokes, but I got cats. So here's a mock-up of what I was showing before. So you get a reward, and I just realized I've left all the good code in. I'm supposed to take it all out before I started. So give me 2 seconds. That's kind of blown it a bit, hasn't it? This is me practicing my slides before I started. Let's try that again. Cool. So we come to claim our reward, and it just pops up on screen, and it's a bit underwhelming. So with a few lines of code, which you've just seen me delete, we can bring back what I was going to give you, like a nice wow moment. But so the thing here is that we import view from react-native-animatable rather than from React Native directly, and that has a bunch of extra props which it will accept. So the first thing, we will tell like the wrapper component, we want it to fade in. So now that looks like that. And we want our card component to zoom in, and we'll give it duration in milliseconds. So now it does that. And here, there's a bunch of these things you can look in the documentation, like what all the different names of them are. Something like that. Right, so you get the idea. I won't finish the rest of it, but hopefully you can see it's pretty easy to build up these kinds of animations that you would have to normally kind of orchestrate, and like, again, tweens and callbacks and horrible stuff like that. So it's really easy to get going with just adding a bit of something to your app. When you have a bunch of these animations running, it can actually get a little bit choppy. I'll explain why in a bit, but there's a curiously named thing that you can, a curiously named prop, which is use native driver. And generally, if you're using this library, you want to stick that on all your views. I'll explain what is going on there, but basically it avoids having to keep going back into JavaScript to do your animations. So this is react-native-animatable. You can't really see that, but basically replace your views with animatable.views, and they have a bunch of different canned animations that you can run. You can also declare your own keyframes and stuff like that. This also feels like cheating, because I think it's a bit too easy. Then this thing, so use native driver, that's a performance optimization, which we'll cover when we get to interactivity. So interactivity is like gestures and swipes and drags and drops, all the kinds of things that people kind of expect of native applications these days. They're kind of the thing that kind of sets your app apart from a web app. You can do these things in web apps, but they generally don't quite feel right. And you can do them in React Native with lots of callbacks and stuff, but again, you tend to feel, it feels that it doesn't quite animate as smoothly as a native app should. So here's some examples. This is Gmail on my phone. So you've got swipe to dismiss, and in a minute, oh yeah, it animates back in, and then you can sort of like play with this side draw. It just gives you a nice like connected feel to that. Something like this, if you know iOS, you've probably seen these types of parallaxing animations, and then the headers transitioning as well, and then also like a bouncy zoom thing. These are all things that they give your app a bit of life, and they need to run at 60 frames per second. If they're not running at 60 frames per second, you're gonna feel janky. So these types of things, so like the swipes for Gmail, they mean you don't have to put lots of buttons everywhere. They don't have to have like a delete button on every single row. You can swipe things away. It's a bit of a trade-off for discoverability of things, but what can you do on small screens? So, oh, here's something else as well. So something that just fades back. This is all stuff done in React Native, by the way. So things that are kind of like a bit springy and yeah, fading things and all kinds of stuff. So the use native driver prop that I talked about earlier, that's a performance optimization to avoid how the rendering usually happens when you're animating stuff in React Native. So in React Native, this is a graph or a chart of time going along that way. Here we've got the native UI, so this is where all your views and text and whatever are rendered on your native platform. So this is iOS and Android. So iOS, there'll be UI views. Android, I don't know what they're called, but they'll have an equivalent. And then you've got your JavaScript code that runs. That's all the normal React stuff. Between them, they have to pass data between each other to tell it how to update your styles. And they have to cross what's called the bridge. I don't know if that's actually the technical term, but that's what everyone calls it. You can tell it's a bridge that you've got to go over because they've got a little rower and a duck. So this is what normally happens if you're interacting with something in React Native. So the native UI will be firing these touch start events and touch move events and that kind of stuff. You can't see this, but that says set style. So the information, the data, like payload, comes over the bridge, comes into React Native. You handle it in JavaScript, and you do something to set the style or set some state, or which ultimately sets some style, and that goes back over the bridge to update the UI. Then you move your finger like 1 pixel, and it comes back over again, and then it does a set style, and it updates the UI. Every time something goes over the bridge, it has to be serialized and unserialized on like either side. Usually this is okay. If your app is doing something else other than just literally exactly what you're doing, what will sometimes happen, there's something else pops up, and JavaScript, being single-threaded, is busy doing like decoding a payload of JSON or something, and you miss a frame. So this call to set style here got missed, and you drop a frame, and that's when you feel like jank. And it's really noticeable. It won't show up in any videos I can show or anything, but it's noticeable when you use it in your own hands. So there's a way to avoid this. Look at that animation. So it's called declarative animation. So this is what this use native driver thing is doing. And instead of every single touch update, every single one having to cross the bridge, what you do is you send, that says config, so you send your configuration of how to animate over to the native UI. And then from then on, everything else happens on the native UI. So your touch start, it just updates locally, and it knows it's had this config that tells it how to update. And that means you don't get drop frames. Like it will run at 60 frames a second unless something's really wrong with your phone. So good things about this, it's declarative and not imperative. It means that you can basically describe, or you have to describe all of the conditions of your animation before it actually happens. So you have to say, given this condition, this is what it will be, or this is what it will do. You You're not like writing callbacks and saying update this value and update that value. When you see this written down, it looks a lot like functional programming. If people use like Ramda and stuff like that, you see a lot of like cons and sets and like those types of things. The config crosses a bridge once and not once per event, and that's why it works. So there's two libraries that work together to do this. One is called React-Native Gesture Handler, and one is called React-Native-Reanimated. I always forget the name of that whenever I'm doing this. I'm going to try and do a little demo of that with some more cats. Okay, so what we've got here, you've probably seen this kind of thing in Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever. There's like a bottom card. You can kind of move up and down and move it to a certain point and it will snap to the top, and move it to a certain point and it will snap to the bottom. So I'll show you how that is implemented. So it starts off by importing pan gesture handler and from React-Native Gesture Handler and animated from React-Native-Reanimated. These have got, so React-Native-Reanimated has a bunch of these things. So if you want to add two numbers together, instead of writing a function that does a plus b, you declare that a and b will be added together at some point. Same with sub, and this is a condition, so instead of writing ifs, you write cons. There's predicates for greater than and defined and all kinds of useful stuff. There is this thing which I've just literally copied from the documentation, which does the spring animation. I think everybody who uses this library basically just copies this and uses it everywhere. No idea how to implement that myself. And then, so how this is implemented is, we have this pan gesture handler, and we say on gesture event and on handler state change. So whenever you do anything, so handler state change is when you start and end a touch, and gesture event is like when you move. We will use this on gesture event. Now that is not like a traditional callback. So this is what this is doing is it's telling React Native gesture handler to extract these properties from the native event and apply them to these animated values. So instead of like normal variables with numbers in, we have these animated values. They are like live values that you can sort of, it's really hard to describe. You don't directly change the value. You never read the value. You just tell it, for instance, you could tell it that A plus B will be C, and that will be true of in all cases. It's never actually going to like do the addition on the JS side. So these kind of like containers for values. They're probably like monads or something, but I don't know. So this is the bit that's doing the animation as we drag up and down. So the first thing is there's a condition. So we check, first of all, is the gesture state active? So that means have we put our finger down on the screen? I'll cover the else condition first. So if the touch isn't happening, then we forget there's some like values that we drive, which remember, if you've ever done like drag and drop, you always have to do like last drag X and last drag Y and this drag current X and do one subtracted from the other. It's all the same here, but it's done with these declarations instead. So we forget our previous drag position, and then we set our translate Y value will obtain internally the value that's derived from all of this stuff. So conditionally on whether we've ever touched this thing before. If we haven't touched this thing before, then our offset Y, so this is all trying to produce a value here, our offset Y will be at the snap to bottom. So snap to bottom is just a magic number that's like near the bottom of the screen. I just made that up. And yeah, so that's if we've never interacted with it. If we have previously interacted and we've let go, then we call this run spring. And then where do we go? Do we go to the top or to the bottom? Because there's 2 snap points. So the way that this works now is it's saying if the translate y value is greater than the midpoint, then it will go to the bottom, otherwise it will go to the top. So what this means, if I drag up here and stop and let go, it will stay to the bottom. If I kind of like flick it up, it's going to return to the bottom.
Does it do something really fun if you swap those 2 around?
Oh, I need to rerun this one. Yeah, so it'll just go the other direction.
It didn't update because it never re-rendered, and therefore the animation didn't change.
Yeah, so that's actually like, so what's going on here? This thing is not a function that runs. It's a declaration of like how our thing will animate. That is run when our class instantiates and is never run again. So I had to reload that component. So if you're into React stuff, then that'll make sense. Yeah, so now this is doing like the wrong thing. So this is like, if I let go at the bottom, it'll snap to the top. Where was that? There. Yeah, so then while the touch is happening, it stops the clock. The clock is what it is. It's like I don't know how to describe it again. It's a kind of like declarative timer thing. Again, look it in the docs. Like it's easy to just copy it from examples, honestly. So this is the kind of stuff that you normally have to do with drag and drop animations, where you're subtracting one value from another and adding it to the current one that it had, and then setting it to this value and all that kind of stuff. And then copy it from when you've finished. You copy the current drag y onto the previous drag y, and then like move on. So if we wanted to change the behavior of this, so instead of, hang on, I need to go back and do that again. So instead of when we let go here, or if we flick it, rather than it depending on where we let go, we could do something like drag vy, so that's our velocity. So if our drag velocity is greater than 0, then go to the bottom, otherwise go to the top. And what that gives us is, so if I let go up here but pulling down, it's going to go to the bottom. If I do go from the bottom and kind of flick it, I don't know if you can really see exactly what's happening, but kind of flick it and let go, it knows, right, you are moving this thing up, so your snap point becomes to the top, and then run the existing spring animation. The spring animation will take into account your the velocity of the thing, so if you cut it to like run various spring animations at different times, it will kind of like follow as a natural spring would, which is really nice. One other nice thing about this, because these are all just like declarations and not like functions that are running. So I'm not really a big fan of comments in code. Yeah, controversial, but so rather than have to do this kind of stuff, where should we go? I can actually extract that to be this dot, where should we go? And then so that is actually the same thing now, because it's just a declaration of configuration of how to act. So you can do this for all kinds of things to get rid of all these nasty comments. So that is that. What else do I have? So yeah, this doesn't feel like cheating. It can be a bit tricky. The code looks a bit weird. If you're used to writing callbacks and you get to like process and follow things from top to bottom, it's a bit more just a bit more difficult to work with if you're used to that kind of thing. But it's performant, that's really important. It's declarative, it's composable as well, so any of those values can be replaced with like another value, like another conditional value, because they all just represent an animated value ultimately. So yeah, come back to like why we do animations. So orientation, if you want to do those kinds of things, then layout animation is really, really good. It'll get you like most of the way there to a like nicely interactive app. If you want to do some basic aesthetic stuff, react-native-animatable is great, and gesture handler and reanimated are really good for the interactive stuff. react-native-reanimated has got an experimental thing that does this, and you can anything which you can describe using react-native-animatable can be described as react-native-reanimated components. So react-native-reanimated, if you want to do any animation and you've got the time to learn it, it's definitely worth learning. So just like a bit of a sort of philosophical thing on animation as well. Like, why do we do it, and when is it good to do it, and when is it good not to? I've got a Venn diagram, and the best bit of a Venn diagram, as we all know, is in the middle. So if you've got something which is an animation which is designed to keep users oriented in your app, to give a feeling of how you want your app to feel, and to be interactive and make your app feel alive, that's the best place to be. When you've done this, show your UI designer. There's two things. First of all, they would like to see like what kind of things are easy to achieve and what kinds of things you can animate, and they would absolutely love it, especially if they're used to kind of like web apps where things are a bit clunky and like that kind of thing. The other thing is you can go a bit nuts with this stuff and animate everything, and UI designers tend to have taste. So many times I've like put all this stuff and then show it to Nick, who sits next to me, and he's like, don't. get rid of most of that. Just put like a little transition on or something. But anyway, it's good fun. So to close off, that was pretty quick, I think. I'm Tom. I work for Candide. We make this. It's a like social network for gardeners, and has like plant ID and all that kind of stuff. This, what I've just presented, is probably the least interesting thing we do. So here's our website. We are hiring. So if you want to do some React Native or Node or machine learning or anything like that, then come speak to me. That's it.